Hello! For those just joining this module, we are working through the Form PI1 General Application, or the PI1 for short, going sheet by sheet. We are using a minor NSR amendment as the example. In this module, I'll be showing you the unit types and emission rates sheet. This is the heart of the workbook, and the sheet you will be spending most of your time on. This format is similar to the existing Table 1A, but there are added features and questions which are used later in the workbook. One feature is that you will now include all sources on the permit for each project, even if those sources are not changing. One advantage of this is it gives us a good picture of what is currently authorized by the permit and what is changing with this project. Listing all of the permit sources also means we can use this document to easily create the MRT. Finally, applicants can use this data for each project instead of retyping different lists for each project. There are a lot of instructions on this sheet, and I highly recommend reviewing them prior to starting data entry to avoid data entry mistakes that cause issues later in the workbook. We also created an examples sheet with many scenarios to help you. This link here can take you directly to that sheet. It's later in the workbook. Step 1 is to use this drop-down to select your industry. This one item is very important for the workbook to function correctly. In this case, I've selected that this is a combustion site. I've entered a sample project to show some of the many options the applicants have for entering scenarios. So I'll describe that sample project right now. The site has 2 turbines, a firewater pump, a flare, 2 diesel tanks, and 2 permit by rules. This project is to increase the operating hours of turbine 2, remove the fire water pump because it was never constructed, install a new paint booth, incorporate by consolidation 2 PBRs, one for an emergency engine and one for additional emissions for the flare, which is currently authorized by this permit. Also, throughput will be increased to the flare because the new paint booth will be routed to it. Turbine 1 and the 2 diesel tanks will not be modified with this project. So I'm going to be going through how to enter all of those project changes in the workbook now. First, we have Turbine 1. Note that I had said Turbine 1 is not changing with this project. So in column A, I've used the drop-down to select Not New or Modified. Note that these drop-down options in this column change depending on the type of project. For an amendment such as this, the options are New or Modified, Not New or Modified, Remove, and Consolidate. If I had selected a project type of renewal and amendment, then my options would be New or Modified, Renew Only, Remove, and Consolidate. And had this just been a straightforward renewal with no amendment, my options would be Renew, Remove, and Consolidate. And we'll see that in a later module on renewals. Next, I indicated that the emissions should be included in the emissions summary. We will talk more about this column and some of the other entries below. The next columns are straightforward, listing the FIN, EPN, and source name for this source. Note that you do not need to list these items in every row if there are multiple pollutants. The conditional formatting will gray out unneeded cells to help guide you. Like the current Table 1A, both the FIN and the EPN are needed. Sometimes they are the same thing, such as with these turbines, but many times they are not. For example, if you have 10 tanks or fins routed to one flare, the EPN. To enter the pollutants, you can use a drop-down list of some common pollutants that we see frequently, or you can also type in any other pollutants that you need to enter. Please note, if you're entering your own pollutants, you need to be careful to be consistent and to check for typos. The formulas are looking for items that are different, so CO will be treated as a different pollutant than typing out carbon monoxide, for example. An easy way to check for this is on the public notice sheet that lists all of the pollutants represented on this sheet in a consolidated list. We'll see that in a later module on the public notice sheet. Also note, applicants should follow current APD practice of quantifying PM, PM10, and PM2.5 for all sources that are emitting particulate matter, and they should be entered as separate line items as seen here. I entered some very generic current emission rates. and then entered what my proposed emission rates are. You'll notice they're the same because I already said this turbine is not being new or modified. If we scroll over a little bit, we can see that the difference has been calculated as 0, of course. I then used a drop-down to select my unit type of turbine, simple cycle, natural gas. Note that this list in the drop-down will vary depending on what type of industry you selected up here. So had I selected, for example, chemical and energy, the drop-down list options would be different. The next source is turbine 2. If you recall, we said that turbine 2 is increasing the hours of operation, so there's an increase in annual emissions. In column A, I've indicated that this is a new or modified source. This means the source is subject to BACT and monitoring. The next several columns are similar to turbine 1 above, and the current emission rates are also similar. You'll notice for the proposed emission rates, this time I have a higher value than what the current emission rates are. Over here in the difference, you can see that it calculated that increase in emissions and highlighted it as green to show that it is an increase. I again use the drop-down to select the unit type. Our third source is the fire water pump, which is to be removed from the permit entirely. So in column A, I use the drop-down to select Remove. I again indicated that yes, I want to include these emissions in the annual summary. Entered my FIN, EPN, source name, list of pollutants, and my current emission rates. This is what is on your current MERT. In the proposed emission rates, I left them blank. Blanks are treated as zeros, so this is interpreted as currently authorized for, say, 1 ton per year of NOx, and we're proposing for it to be decreased to 0 tons per year of NOx by removing this source. In the difference columns, you can see that decrease in all of the areas, and they're highlighted in blue to show it's a decrease. I again use the drop-down box in the unit types to select the appropriate unit type. Note, this decrease will be included in the public notice determination. That's why it's important to include all sources that are being removed in this summary table. The fourth source is a new paint booth, which will be routed to the existing flare. In column A, I indicated that this is a new source. In column B, I selected No, do not include these emissions for the individual booth in the emission summary. This is because the booth emissions will be accounted for on the flare line. Other scenarios where you might select No is for multiple operating scenarios or for caps. There are examples of these on the example sheet of this workbook. There are no current emission rates, so that is left blank because this is a new source. I've entered the proposed emission rates here. You can see the increases accounted for here. And in the unit types list, if I were to look, I would see that there is no paint booth anywhere in this list. You may recall we selected that we are located at a combustion site. Paint booths at combustion sites are not very common, so it's not in the common list of unit types. I have the option to instead select Other and then to type in my own unit type. Please clearly define the unit type, such as here, calling it a paint booth. This unit type name is carried forward onto the BACT and monitoring sheet, so it's important to know what we're applying BACT to. The fifth source we'll be looking at is an emergency engine. This source is currently authorized by a permit by rule, and we will be incorporating it by consolidation. In column A, I've selected Consolidate. This means this source will be subject to BACT and monitoring review. I entered the emissions authorized by the PBR over here in the Consolidate columns. Note that emissions being consolidated are not included in the difference columns and are not included when determining public notice applicability. So in this scenario, we're consolidating 2 tons per year of NOx, and the MERT will show 2 tons per year once the consolidation is complete, and there's an increase of 0 because these emissions are already authorized by that PBR and are just being consolidated. I again use the drop-down option to select the appropriate unit type. Our next source is the flare. You may recall the flare is currently authorized by this permit. However, there are some emissions authorized by a permit by rule, which will be incorporated by consolidation with this project. In addition, there is an increase with the new paint booth being routed to the flare. So the source is being modified, and the other columns we've talked about. Over here, we've entered what the current emission rates are that are represented on the current MRT of this permit. In the consolidated column here, I've listed the emissions authorized by the permit by rule, which will be consolidated with this project. In the proposed column, I've listed the total I want to show on the new MRT when this project is complete. This includes the current emission rates, the PBR emissions to be consolidated, as well as the increases from the paint booth being routed to this flare. Here in the difference column, you can see there's an increase of 1 ton per year, and it does not include the consolidated PBR emissions. And again, I selected the appropriate unit type. Finally, we have the existing tanks, which are not changing here, tank 1 and tank 2. They are routed to the flare, so the flare is listed as the EPN, and I indicated no for including them in the emission summary. You may recognize that columns D, E, F, G, and H look a lot like your MRT. This allows us to easily and accurately create a MRT from the file without retyping any EPNs, emission rates, or pollutants. It also means that you can copy-paste from an existing MRT directly into this workbook, minimizing applicant data entry. I'll now show you how you can copy-paste as values from an existing MRT. First, you'll open an existing MRT and select the data that you want to copy. We'll return back to our workbook, and we want to paste, matching the destination formatting. Ta-da! There it is. So this can save you a lot of time with your data entry. All right, that's a lot of information. As you've gathered, this sheet has a lot of important steps for the project and for the functionality of the workbook. Again, I suggest you review the instructions in the examples sheet before starting any data entry on this sheet. Some of you may have noticed that I typed out carbon monoxide in this location, but use CO in many of the other areas. We'll go over how this will show up on the public notice sheet and how to fix it during the public notice module later on.